Are you guys ready for Halloween? I know I am. I am the biggest Halloween fan out there. Me and my daughter, this is our favorite holiday and our favorite season of the whole year. And what better way to celebrate Halloween with a witch hat? Now, I know quilted witch hats are all the rage right now. So, of course, I had to jump on the bandwagon and hand draft my own pattern for one, but I wanted to make mine with a little bit of a twist. Most witch hats are straight and pointy, and I wanted to give mine a little zhuzh, a little garden witch kick, if you will. So mine has an optional dart that you can put in it to give it a little bit of that shape. You could turn it sideways. You can make the point go sideways. You can make the point go to the back. It is a fully quilted project. You can use a repurposed quilt for this. So you could find a quilt at a thrift store or in your cabinet or whatever, go buy a new one, a manufactured one from a store. However you want to do it, you can do it with one of those. The only difference is with one of those, you're going to omit the batting and the lining from this pattern, and you're going to finish the brim edge with some sort of binding, like a bias tape, or cut your own bias tape out of some really pretty fabric that maybe contrasts or matches it. I do have a tutorial on my website that's free to download how to make magic bias tape. So you could do that. But this one, we're going to use I'm going to use two different colors on my next example. I made this one for my daughter. It's black and it's got little stars all over it. It's super cute. It kind of matches my outfit I've got going on today. So this is a super easy project. It's great for beginners to practice sewing curves because obviously the brim is curved. So you're gonna sew around two circles basically. Um, so some of the supplies that you're gonna need for your little witch hat. Now I made this one with cotton batting. So like your everyday cotton batting that you can get at the store. And the brim on it is quite floppy. I did starch this one to try to make it a little stiffer. So today on mine, I think I'm going to try something different. So you're going to need two different colors of quilting cotton. So I'm going to make mine more like a garden witch theme because I'm an herbalist and my kids say that I'm a garden witch. So I'm going to make mine out of some floral fabric with some green for the bottom of the brim for the lining. Um, you're going to need some quilt batting. So for this one, I'm going to use the polyester quilt batting. This one is a low loft batting, meaning that it's kind of thin. I do have some high loft batting, I think, over there in my stash. So I think I'm going to try that to make the brim a little more stiff. You could also use flex foam, which is one of my very favorite products. If you do use flex foam, you're going to have to piece it together because flex foam is not wide enough to do the brim on. But I think what I'm going to do, if I don't have high loft batting, which means it's like twice as fluffy, I'm just going to double the layer up of this to make it a little bit more stiff, a little more quilted. You're going to need the PDF pattern that comes in my pattern on my website, and you're going to piece it together. And I'm going to show you how to do that because I've had some questions on my patterns of like how to piece them together. You're going to need a pair of scissors or a rotary cutter. If you're good with a rotary cutter and can cut curves with that, you can use that. Some sort of marking pen so that you can mark the center, front, and back of your hat. And then you'll also need some clips or pins. And my son got me this fun little cast iron cauldron as a gift, and so I keep my pins in it. It's super cute. It's got little stars and moon or little moon phases on it, so it kind of goes with the hat and all. But I keep my clips in this on my desk. So super easy project. You can put it together, and it just probably minus the quilting, which if depending on the design that you do, that could take you a little bit of time. But putting it together after your fabric is quilted, or if you used a pre-quilted fabric or repurpose a quilt, this can go together in mere minutes. So it's great for last minute costumes, great for Halloween, or if you're just one of those witchy girls, great for all year long. So let me show you how to put this pattern together. Okay, when you print out a PDF pattern, and this is usually, most patterns are like this. What I've started doing is I've started putting a big number on each piece. That way you know where the pieces go. And I like to do a strip of gray right here, or a line to show you where to overlap the pieces. So this one says overlap 2 here. So you're just going to line up your pages and overlap piece 2 to right there, and then you're going to tape it together. And then same for 3 and 4. You're just going to overlap those, tape those together, and then you're going to overlap 1 and 2 on top of 3 and 4. Now, with some printers, when you print these out, you need to print on 100% scale. If you don't print at 100% scale, then the size of your any sewing pattern that you print PDF, if you don't sew it at 100% scale, there's a chance that the sizing could be off on this. Also, my patterns are all hand drafted. I hand draw all of my patterns. I scan them in, and then I put them on my iPad in a program called Procreate, and then I retrace over those lines. And so everything is hand drawn. So depending on your printer, how it feeds the paper, how it's been scanned in, all of those things can affect the lines not matching up perfectly. So if your lines don't match up exactly perfectly, that's okay. Just you've kind of got the gist of the shape of the pattern. Sewing, because we have a seam allowance, sewing has a lot of leeway in it for sizing and little misprints and all of that kind of stuff. So if your pattern pieces don't exactly match up, especially when I'm hand drawing curves, it's very hard to get them to match perfectly when I'm doing it on separate pieces like this. So eventually one day I'm going to create bigger pattern pieces that you can have printed at a print shop, and all of that will of course line up because it'll all be one piece. But if they don't match up perfectly, don't fret. Just be sure that you have printed out your PDF pattern on 100% scale, and then just follow the directions of where to overlap them, tape them all together. I've also seen people sew them together. So they will pin their pattern pieces together and then run it through the sewing machine so that they're stitched together. You can also do that. So you're going to pin these 4 pattern pieces together. Then you're going to cut out your pattern with paper scissors, not your sewing scissors. And then you're going to pin it to your fabric and cut them out. Both pieces need to be on the fold. So there are markings on the pattern pieces, let's see, that look like this. This means to put this piece on the fold. So you want to make sure that your fabric is folded and that edge will go on the fold. Same with the hat piece. There is a on the fold mark also for that one. So once you get all your pattern pieces cut out, I'm going to meet you over at the sewing machine and show you the first step. I thought I would show you how to cut out the fabric also, because I have also had some questions about that. I have a whole yard of fabric here, which is what I have written in the pattern, but I think I may go back and change that because you don't actually need like a whole yard of each color for this. So this pattern piece measures just over 18 inches. So you're going to need a little bit more than a half a yard. And then you're going to take your selvage edges and fold them in and put your pattern pieces on the fold like this. So this is where, you can't even see this. This is where the fold is on my hat piece. And then, so cut your hat piece first because you'll have to fold it a little bit further than the center for that piece. And then you can fold the other selvage in for your brim piece to cut out. And so this edge is going on the fold over here. And then you just cut around these, cut out your outside fabric. You're going to cut out your lining, and you're also going to cut out your batting the same way. Okay, now that you have all your pattern pieces cut out and all of your batting cut out, like I said, I'm going to double up my batting to make it just a little bit stiffer, a little more quilted. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to sandwich your quilt batting between your 2 hat pieces of fabric, and we're going to quilt this piece first. And I'm going to quilt it before I cut out the optional darts. That way I make sure everything lines up really well. Sometimes when you quilt stuff, things shift around. And so just be sure to add lots of pins in there or spray baste it. You can use something called a 505 spray. Let's see. Oh, I think I'm out of my 505 spray, but this one's from Hobby Lobby. It's just a quilt basting spray. You can spray this on your quilt batting and stick your fabric down. This one's just about empty, so I'm using good old traditional pins. So I'm just pinning this all over, and then I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to quilt it. And I think I'm going to do diagonal lines on this one. The other one I did little squares. I think I'm just going to do diagonal lines on this one, going parallel to one of the straight edges on here. So you're going to get this on here. You're going to quilt this. And then you're also going to take your circle pieces. Now, I didn't cut the center circle out of my quilt batting yet, because the first thing you're going to do with this, if you don't want to bind the edges and you don't want to use bias tape or binding like around the outside edge, the first thing you're going to need to do is sew your two brim pieces together, right sides together, pin it around this edge, and sew at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the outside edge. And then notch your curve, and then turn it and press it. And then you're going to insert your quilt batting in between that. So I didn't want to have to like line up the holes, so I just didn't cut the hole on that one yet. So I'm also going to do that after I get done quilting my hat piece. So let's head over to the sewing machine. Okay, first step is to quilt our hat piece. And so I've got it all pinned together here. And I think I'm going to do 1-inch lines all the way across. So I'm going to move my quilting guide to my 1-inch mark. And I've got it loaded up with my black thread to match. So the first thing I'm going to do is just line up this edge with my quilting guide to make my initial line. And then every line after that, I'm just going to line up the stitching line with the edge of my quilting guide, and that'll space them out 1 inch. Now, if you don't have one of these, most domestic machines come with one of these nowadays. But if for some reason you don't have one of these with your machine, you can always get a ruler and a marking pen and draw your lines. You could also use something called a Hera marker. Let's see if I can dig that out, which looks like this. This is a Hera marker. And all this is a sharp edge right here that will make a crease in your fabric whenever you make lines in it. So you can just sew along those creases. You just crease it down and it makes a line. So you could also use one of those. My favorite marking pens are basically friction pens, which are heat erasable pens. This is a set that I ordered off of Amazon. It came with like a bazillion of these refills that you just pop in here to refill the pen, and it erases with heat. So when you iron it, it'll just disappear. They come in a bunch of different colors, so that's one of my other favorite things. If not, you can use an air erasing marker, but you have to work kind of quickly because those will fade. You can also use something like this. This is a chalk pencil or a chalk wheel, and it just makes lines on there with the chalk. So lots of different options for marking your fabric if you want to mark out your quilting lines. But I am just going to go ahead and stitch all of these. I'm going to quilt at a stitch length of 5, so it goes a little bit quicker. And then it doesn't really matter, because if the stitch length is really long, it's not as long as you're not doing the longest stitch length on your machine, because that may start to gather it a little bit. But we'll lengthen the stitch length a little bit so it'll go a little bit faster. And then we're just going to go ahead and quilt all the way across this. Now, something else you can use is called a walking foot. And basically what that does is your feed dogs underneath are pushing your fabric forward, and then the walking foot will also push your fabric forward at the same time, so that nothing really shifts. So if you have one of those, that would be a good time to use. Now would be a good time to use that. I don't have one of those for this machine, but I use an 1/8 inch presser foot, so it kind of helps with not shifting things too much. But also, if you just go slow and push your batting down in front of your presser foot, it'll also help things from shifting. Okay, now I've got this quilted. I went ahead and did the diagonals both directions because I was having so much fun with it. So I'm going to take this over to my cutting table over there, and I'm going to clean up the edges because it shifted a little bit and the batting is sticking out. So I'm just going to go around and clean up all the edges. I also basted around all the edges on here to keep both layers together. So I'm going to go clean that up. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take my 2 circles. So I've got my 2 brim pieces, and I'm going to lay them right sides together. So pretty side to touching pretty side. And you can pin this around the edges or clip it, but because I'm a rebel seamstress, I never do that. And I'm going to sew this around the edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to make little clips about 1 inch to 1.5 inches all the way around, close to but not through your stitches, so that that curve will lay flat whenever you turn it. So I'm going to move my quilting guide back over to a 1/4 inch so I can keep that seam allowance going fairly evenly all the way around the curves. Now, like I said, pin this or clip this around this edge if you're not confident at keeping your pieces together. And I'm going to turn my stitch length back down to a 3.5, and we're just going to sew all the way around. So when you're using something like this, like a quilting guide or a stitch guide, they also make the kind that magnet down to the plate. My problem with that is I have these screws right here and my screws are not flat, so I can't get anything to magnet flat down to my plate. But when you're sewing with one of these, you don't look at the needle where it's stitching, you look at your edge of your fabric with your guide. Also, when you're not using one of these and you're looking at the stitch lines right here to give your seam allowance, you look at that, not at where your needle is. A lot of beginners get focused very much on their needle, and then their seam allowance and their stitches are very wavy. If you look at the edge of your fabric against one of your lines of where your guide is, and keep focused on that and not look at the needle going up and down, it'll help keep your seam allowance a little more even. Okay, back stitch when you get back to the beginning. And now we're going to take our scissors, and you want a fairly sharp pair of scissors to do this with. These are called the Perfect Scissor, and they come with this little cover on them. I got these when we went on our Alaskan cruise, and we went to a quilt shop in Juneau, Alaska, and she was showing me these. These are extremely sharp all the way up to the tippy tip, so you have to be very careful with them. But you're going to make little clips about every 1 inch to 1.5 inches all the way around. But don't cut through your stitching line. You just want to cut up close to your stitching line. So you'll want a pair of scissors that are fairly sharp all the way up to the tip to be able to do this. So you're just going to go all the way around. And what this is going to do is this is going to allow the fabric and the seam allowance to spread a little when you turn it right side out, so that you'll get a nice crisp edge when you press it. So just clip all the way around, and then we're going to take this over to our ironing board. We're going to flip it right side out, and we're going to give it a good press all the way around the edge to make sure you have a nice clean edge of the brim of your hat. Okay, we have quilted our hat piece, and I've trimmed up where it shifted a little. Happens every time you quilt something, unless you've got things stuck down really, really well, they're going to shift a little. It's okay, just trim it. This is just a hat, so don't worry about trimming off a little bit. So now what you're going to do is you're going to fold your hat piece back in half like when you cut it out. And you're going to take the pattern piece, and I have gone ahead and just cut one side of my optional dart, and I've folded it down so you can see where the dart is. And we're going to lay that on here and mark where our dart goes. I'm actually going to do this on the back side because my fabric is black and I won't be able to see my mark. So we're going to lay this on here, and then we are going, oops, not on the fold. Dart goes on the open edge. Don't do what I was fixing to do and cut into the middle of your hat. The dart goes on the edge that does not have the fold on it. I have marked this pattern piece all like crazy and stuff. So you're going to mark your dart and cut this triangle out if you want the optional dart. So what that does is that creates this little bend in the hat so that it doesn't go straight up and down. It kind of gives it this little crooked look. I love that on witches' hats. So I've marked my dart on the straight edge of our little triangle here, and you're going to cut it on both sides. So I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut out the first side, and then that way I can see where to cut the second side. I hope that's making sense. So I've cut one side of my triangle out, and now I'm going to cut the other side. So you should end up with a piece that looks like this, where there's two little cutouts in the straight edges of your triangle. Now what you're going to do is you're going to fold these right sides together so that this little triangle sides, they meet. So see if I can hold this up against the white wall so you can see it. So you're going to fold that to where this makes a straight line, and you're going to sew these at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now the inside of this hat ends up having raw edges on the inside. If you don't like raw edges on your project, you can always zigzag over those edges. If you have a domestic machine that zigzags, mine does not zigzag. It was meant for quilting, so it just only does a straight stitch. Or you can serge over those edges if you have a serger, or you can use pinking shears and just cut them with a little zigzag pinking shears. That makes sure that your fabric doesn't fray. This is way up on the inside of this hat, so nobody's really going to see it up in there. So I'm not really going to worry about finishing those edges. Now the edge around the brim of your hat where it connects, you can finish that in the same way. Zigzag, serge it. I cut this one with a pinking shear, and then you're going to top stitch that seam allowance up so it's not going to fray. So unless you have fabric that really frays a lot, like satin might fray. But for this, I'm not really even going to worry about finishing the edges like that. So you're just going to fold your dart, and you're going to sew these at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then while I'm over here at the table, I have turned my brim right side out, and I've ironed around the edges really, really well so it's nice and flat. Now when I cut out my circle of quilt batting, now it's bigger than my pattern piece. That's normal because you made a seam allowance around there, so it's taken off a little bit. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to take your quilt batting, and you're going to need to trim that outside edge by about, I would do a little more than a 1/4 inch so that it will fit inside here really well. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, you're going to trim off of the outside edge of your circle. Now, I still have not cut the middle circle out of this yet because I want to make sure everything kind of lines up after I quilt it. So you're going to trim that off, and then you're going to insert it inside your brim. Okay, so I've trimmed that off, and so we're just going to take this and we're going to open this up, and from the center, we're just going to insert this into the brim of our hat and get it laying nice and flat. So you want to insert it in between the two layers. And you may have to trim a little more if it's not fitting quite right. It's okay to do that. I think sometimes people get caught up on pattern pieces not fitting together exactly perfect. But when you have an actual human cutting out your fabric, and the fabric moves, and people have different ways of holding the scissors and stuff, sometimes it's not exactly perfect. So that's okay. Learning how to sew, you learn how to work with your materials. Okay, so I've got that all in here, tucked in there nice and evenly and smooth and flat, and making sure that my outer edge is still pressed out nice and neat. And then now you're going to quilt this. You can quilt it in any design that you want. I think what I'm going to do is maybe do some circles. I might go across this way and across this way just to hold the fabric down, and then do some circles. Not quite sure yet. We'll see when I get over there. You just want to make sure that you pin through all of these layers so that it doesn't shift too much when you're quilting it. And then when you get done, you're going to cut out your circle right there. Okay, so we're going to quilt this, and then we're going to cut out our circle, and we're going to sew our little darts together on the brim of our hat. All right, I think I settled on maybe doing 1-inch circles. So I'm going to line up my quilting guide back on the 1-inch mark, and I'm going to line it up with the inside brim of this. And it helps if you kind of roll it up in here when you're working, especially with a domestic machine. This is made for quilting, so my throat plate here is really wide. Most domestic machines are not quite this wide. So if you need to, roll it up along that side, and then I'm going to put my stitch length back out at a 5, and then I'm just going to go around. Oop, became unthreaded. Let me rethread this, and then I'm just going to go around in circles. Okay, now that I've got that out, the inside circle done, I wanted to make sure those two circles kind of stayed lined up. I'm going to go around the brim now this way, which will probably be easier. Okay, I have rewound my bobbin, and because I ran out like literally an inch and a half from the end, I have made all of my quilted circles. I'm going to take this over to my ironing board and press it really well, and then I'm going to trim out this inner circle right here. Okay, I took this over to my ironing board. I pressed it really well on both sides. Doing circles kind of made it a little bit bunchy, but that's all right. I like it the way it looks. But you could do this in cross hatches, however you wanted to do it. And then I cut out the inner circle of my quilt batting. So we're ready to assemble it. So quilting will take you the longest on this. The rest of it, easy peasy. So if you had pre-quilted fabric, this would go together in no time. So we're going to take our upper hat piece where we cut out the darts, and we're going to fold the darts right sides together, so pretty sides touching pretty sides, and then we're going to sew across this little seam right here at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Move my quilting guide back over to 1/4 inch, and you want to back stitch at the beginning and the end, especially at the inside of your dart. That will hold it together really well. Now, like I said, you can finish these any way you want to. They're going to be up inside your hat, so you're not really going to see it, but if you wanted to zigzag this or serge it, you can. I'm just going to use a pair of pinking shears and trim this off so that the fabric does not fray. Now, this is quite thick, so be careful cutting through it. You may need to cut it a layer at a time. Okay, so when you do pinking shears, it comes out with little zigzags like that. That prevents the fabric from fraying. So now you have one dart on one side, and now you're going to do the other dart on the other side. So right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then trim that if you want to. Okay, and now you've got something that looks kind of like this. Now we're going to take our two straight edges with the darts, and we're going to match them up. And you'll want to pin or clip this together to keep them straight. And you're going to match up those darts, and you're going to do what's called nesting your seam allowance. So one seam allowance is going to go down, the other seam allowance is going to go up. And that will help it from being too bulky right there when you sew across it. And you're just going to match this all the way up to the point. And again, we're going to stitch this at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, something you could do, because this is kind of hard to cut through with pinking shears, is you could take this seam, each edge, and cut these with your pinking shears ahead of time, and then do the other side and then sew them together, and it won't be quite as thick. I'm probably not even going to bother trimming this because it's going to be on the inside of my hat, and I don't really care if it's raw edges up inside the hat. Nobody's going to see it, so it doesn't have to be perfect. If I was selling these, I would be doing it on my serger. Okay, when you get to those dart seams, just make sure they are nested, one going one way, one going the other way. And when you get to that dart, you're going to put your needle down and you're going to pivot right there, so it'll give it that corner. And then when you get up to the very end up here at the point, back stitch a couple of times to give you a nice sharp point at the top of your hat. Now we're going to need to trim this seam allowance out of here a little bit, because when you go to turn this right side out, all of this is going to be stuffed up in this point of the hat. And so you want to make sure that that's going to not be too bulky up there. So don't cut through your stitch line, but trim away quite a bit of that seam allowance up here like that, so that there's not all of that bulk being shoved up in the point of your hat. Okay, so you have that trimmed. Now, like I said, finish these seam allowances however you want to do that. And now we're going to turn it right side out. And you're going to want to poke out that point as well as you can. So I like to work it with my fingers till I can't do it anymore with my fingers and my fingernails. And then I will take something like a chopstick or a point turner out of my little caddy over here. So I've got these listed on my website. This is just a 3D printed point turner with a pokey edge on there. You just want to be careful not to poke through your fabric, which can happen, and that's so frustrating when you get to this point of a project and you've poked a hole through it. So just keep working on it until you can get it turned all the way out. If you're having a little bit of trouble, you could use something like a stiletto to help kind of pull out from the outside. You could also use a chopstick. Just don't use the point of your scissors. I have done that before and stabbed right through my project. Okay, I think I have that turned out about as far as it's going to go. You can feel there's a lot of seam allowance up in there, and so it's kind of hard up in there. That's okay. Just get it out as far as you can get it to make it pointy. And see, with that little dart in there, it gives you that really cute little garden witch curvature on the hat. A little bit of a curve. Kind of reminds me of Sanderson sisters on, oh my gosh, went right out of my head. Oh, went right out of my head. Hocus pocus. Okay, so now what you're going to do is you're going to take your hat piece and you're going to fold it in half with the seam on one side and mark the center of the front. So I'm just going to mark mine with a pen because I have black fabric, so it's really hard to mark on to see it. And then you're going to take your center front and match it up with the back seam. Make sure I'm on the camera. Match up your center front with your back seam, and you're going to get the sides of your hat piece. So you're basically just, you're going to mark the quadrants, and then you're going to do the same with your brim. Now I started my stitching right here, which I probably should have started it over here on the black part so you wouldn't be able to see that, but I'm going to use where I started and stopped my stitching, and I did my back stitching. I'm going to use that as my center back. So I'm going to mark that with a pin for my center back, and I'm going to fold it in half. Let's see if I can get all of this on camera. I'm going to fold this in half this way to mark the center front. And then same thing, match up those pins this way. So we're going to match up those pins, and then we're going to mark our sides. And then you're just going to match up all those pins with right sides together and pin around the circle and sew it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, let me see if I can zoom out a little bit. There we go. All right, so we're going to match this up with the right sides together. So I'm going to take my cone of my hat and put it inside like that. Okay, where did my back one go? This one is my back one. So that one's going to touch the back seam. And so I'm going to pin that. So see, the right sides, the pretty side to pretty side, right sides together are going to be touching. So we're going to do the back seam first and then do the two front centers. I have a bad habit of sticking those pins in my mouth and then I can't talk. And then you're going to match up your side seams, or your side marks, not seams. And then do the other side. And then you're going to do what's called easing. So if for some reason your circles don't fit together exactly perfect, you need to do what's called easing. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take the excess here, like this is just a little bit too big for this curve. So you're just going to kind of ease it in there. You're just going to kind of find the middle of it and pin it together, and then ooch it around a little bit and find the next part and pin it together. And you're going to do this all the way around. until you have your hat piece attached to your brim with right sides together. And make sure you're catching all the layers of your fabric in there. Okay, once you have that pinned and clipped, now you're just going to take this to your machine. You're going to put it on this way so that you can sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around that circle. I'm trying to think if there's any other way you can do it. If your machine has where you can take it off and you have an open throat, here, oh, oops. So if you can take off all the pieces of your machine and you can have a free arm where you can put things underneath it, you can also do it like that. Mine is a little bit too big for that. So I'm going to leave my quilting table on here because it helps keep things flat. And I'm just going to sew from the inside. But you want to start at the back seam and you're going to sew this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is going to start getting kind of bulky in there, so just go slow and kind of push things down as they get close to the presser foot. Just watch your fingers and don't sew over your fingers. And back stitch when you get back to the beginning. And then you have your hat. Looks great, right? Okay, now you can finish this seam off in any way you want to. Serge it, zigzag, all the things. You could take some binding and put binding around it or bias tape around it if you wanted to. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim it up. I'm going to push my seam allowance up and I'm going to top stitch right along this edge up here so that it kind of stays out of the way. So let me trim this up. Be right back. Okay, I've been contemplating the best way to describe what I'm doing. Basically, I'm going to take this seam allowance and I'm going to push it up towards the inside of the hat. And then I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the seam that we just did. Now, normally I would do top stitching on this side, but when I did the black and white hat, what happened was where this was not trimmed quite straight, some of it didn't catch. So I think on this one, I'm going to try doing it from the inside. I think you might be able to see it, catch it a little better because you can see the seam allowance. And so I'm going to just take the seam allowance and start at the back. And I'm going to put my hat in here with the wrong sides facing up. Now this right here is a little bit bulky, so I'm going to cut a little bit of this seam allowance out of there so that it's not quite so bulky. So I'm just going to cut the corner off of that little seam right there. Because I know some domestic machines might not be able to sew through this. Since mine's a quilting machine, it's kind of got a little more power behind it. But I'm going to just push this seam allowance up and I'm going to go 1/8 of an inch away from this seam allowance. Now you don't have to do this. You could, like I said, you could finish this any way that you wanted to. I feel like trying to bind this might be kind of hard for a beginner because it is on a curve, but also trying to push your seam allowance up and sewing at 1/8 of an inch might be a little hard for a beginner too. You don't even have to do this if you don't want to. It's not really going to show. I just know that if I have that quilt batting touching my forehead, that it might irritate my forehead. So I'm just going to push this up. And one thing I like about this 1/8 inch presser foot is I can just line up this stitch line right on the edge of my presser foot. And so I know that I'm going at 1/4 of an inch. I mean, 1/8 of an inch. It's great for top stitching. I do a lot of bag making. And so there's a lot of top stitching and bag making. So that's where that comes in handy. Now, when you're doing this, you want to feel around and make sure that you've got everything as flat as possible. So that you're not making any creases or sewing any bumps in the on the outside. Just make sure your fingers are out of the way whenever you're doing this so that you don't sew over your fingers. I have done that a time or two in my 40 plus years of sewing. Not fun. All right. So I've got that top stitch. So on the outside, it just gives it a little finished edge along here. And when you have matching thread, it doesn't even show. But so you can see I did a little line right across there. So on the inside, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to trim all of this excess quilt batting away from the seam. So I'm just going to give it a little haircut, trim that up, and then we are done. All right, what do we think? I think it turned out great. I was looking in my mirror over here. This one seems a little more pointy, and I think it's because I doubled up on the batting, so it's a little less floppy than this hat turned out, but I think it turned out great. I love the little curve in the brim, in the point of the hat. Makes it a little, gives it a little character. I do like how the double batting worked for this brim. It's not quite so floppy in my face. I did do some spray starch on here when I pressed it. I gave it a good press after I got done. So anyway, I think they turned out fabulous. My hair is going to be a mess, but see the inside, you're never even going to see it when it's on. So if you can't fish that through your machine because it's gotten too big and bulky, don't worry about it. Just trim off a lot of the quilt batting with some little sharp scissors and you won't even see it because you won't even see up inside there. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I'm so excited for Halloween. We have a market coming up this weekend that we're going to be wearing both of these at for this little Halloween market that we're doing for my daughter's bags in her bag company. I've got a ponytail in the back of my hair that makes it hard to get on. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial and be sure to do all the YouTube things, like, subscribe, all of those things, turn on the bell so you know when I put up a new tutorial. I am still working my way through this year, trying to get out one pattern every week this year. It's been about every 10 days so far, but I do have the right amount of patterns out for the weeks that we've passed by this year. So I'm still averaging a pattern a week for this year, so I'm pretty proud of that. But be sure to follow me on all the social media. I'm at By the Bay Bag Co. on everything, especially TikTok. I like to do some short tutorials on there, also some announcements when new patterns are coming out. So anyway, I hope to see you on all the social media. Please tag me if you make one of these. I love to see everybody's fabric combinations when they make one of my patterns. And be sure to check out my website at bythebaybagco.com, where all of my patterns are listed. Most of them are free or $5. I have a couple that are a little more expensive because they require a little more work to produce them, but most of them are about $5. So anyway, I hope you guys have a happy Halloween and get lots of candy when you trick or treat. Bye.